Hey guys, I'm Andrea Dunlop. So for the final video in this series, I wanted to offer some practical advice for writing about groups and cultures that you are not yourself a member of. So thus far in this series, I've covered this topic from a bunch of different angles, between talking about what a sensitivity reader is, discussing some of the controversy around them, and including a number of kind of case studies of authors who tried to write about another culture and it was not received well at all. But beyond hiring a sensitivity reader, which, despite its insufficiencies, which I've discussed here, I still think can be really helpful. I wanted to offer some practical advice that I've gleaned along the way while I've been researching this, about writing characters from marginalized groups that you don't belong to. So I'm pulling from a bunch of great sources here, which I highly recommend reading in full. If you're tackling this, I'm going to round a bunch of them up on the blog. And I also recommend getting a copy of a very short book called Writing the Other by authors Nisi Shawl and Cynthia Ward. This is a short, funny, extremely helpful book with really fun exercises and excellent advice. So as always, I just want to add the caveat that I am not positioning myself here as an expert, but as someone who can hopefully serve as a helpful guide through this topic using my lens as an author and publishing person. Okay, so first up, it's a really good idea to spend some time interrogating your motives for writing a marginalized character from a group that you're not a part of. I laughed out loud when I was reading an interview with Danielle Clayton, who I've talked about a bunch during this series, when she said that whenever she asked an author that she was working with as a sensitivity reader, why they were writing a character from a certain perspective, the author always answered that they didn't know, the character just walked into their head that way. The reason I laughed at this is because that's exactly how I would have answered that question. And obviously, that's just not quite sufficient. So, the alchemy of writing fiction is always a little bit mysterious. And it does, I think, for many of us, feel as though the characters kind of walk into our heads fully formed. But, obviously we are always pulling from inspiration around us. And so I think it's really good to get a handle on why you're writing the character from that perspective so that you can approach the task with integrity. And you don't have to ask yourself this question right as you're starting on page one. You can ask yourself this a couple of drafts in. But I think if you don't ask yourself this question, your chance of having blind spots is much worse. Okay, so next up, read all the books. If you are writing about a community that you are not a part of, you should be reading dozens of books, memoir, YA, novels, poetry, that come from Own Voices creators from that community. Now, not only is this going to be great for your research and the book that you're working on, but it's just great in general. It's a great feeling of our industry that Own Voices content gets marginalized and kind of can be harder to find. But it's definitely, partly on us to make that effort. And, I'm going to link to a whole bunch of bookstagrammers and book bloggers that I love in my blog post to go along with this video, that cover Own Voices books, so that makes them, they'll pop right up there in your feed, and they will always you will always have a diverse list of books on your radar. So you can do you should be doing lots of other research as well, including watching movies, television shows, reading blogs. But I think that this is, reading books is especially important because of the empathy factor. So if you're one of those writers that says, oh, I really don't like to read other books while I'm writing, I know that's true for some folks, this is time to make an exception or take a long break, in between drafts and read a whole bunch of books at a time. Okay, so on to my next point, which is that empathy is everything here. So, let your heart and your imagination guide you through this process. I'm going to read this entire quote from a great piece that I'll link to on the blog by author Brandon Taylor that he wrote for LitHub. This paragraph is just so good. So he says, "There can be no story without empathy. Our stories begin because we are able to enter the lives of other people. We are able to imagine how a person might move through the world, how their family might operate, what their favorite foods might it be how their nation works, how their town works, and the smallest, most inconsequential aspects of their lives rise up to meet us at our desks. You can't write if you can't empathize. Solipsism is anathema to good writing. So I just think that this gets at a really essential truth, which is that getting the characters with different identities right is just about good writing, which is always, always about empathy and detail. Okay, so next up, understand the stereotypes and tropes that you might come up against. So there are so many stereotypes that are baked into our culture that we as writers may reproduce them without, ever meaning to. And there are some that, are even sort of positive sounding on the surface, such as, the overachieving Asian student or the strong Black woman, that actually have really ugly roots. So, this isn't to say that all of your characters, from marginalized backgrounds should be sanitized to perfection and sainthood. Like, of course they shouldn't. They should be given, the full range of humanity that of any other character that you would write. That's what makes fiction compelling. But, you just want to be aware of the tropes and stereotypes that you want to avoid because, among other things, that's just bad writing. So for you, you want to have your eye on these tropes as though they're landmines to avoid. Okay, so really important step is to get feedback. So whether you go the route of hiring a sensitivity reader officially, or if you just have a trusted friend or colleague who is from that background, who shares that identity that you're writing about, don't let your book wend through the publishing process without taking this step and being proactive about it. As we've seen from just a few of the case studies that I talked about in my videos in this series, publishing has a terrible track record with this. And it is your name that is going to be on the book and your reputation that will take the worst hit if things go badly. So I think get that feedback. Do your best to check your fragility at the door when you're receiving it. Of course, you're never going to write a book to everyone's liking, and you are under, no obligation to accept every single piece of feedback that you receive. But I think it's really important to take the time to, go to people in that community to read your work before it gets published. So lastly, I want to say, this is just writing. Like at the end of the day, writing outside of your own life experience is a bigger challenge than writing something that really, is reflective of the communities or atmosphere that you grew up with. But it's still just writing. There's no special trick or technique here other than doing your due diligence that you would put towards any other subject matter that you really want to go in depth on for your book. Books full of tropes and stereotypes have always been bad, they've always been gross, and they've always done harm, long before Twitter existed for people to organize hashtags around it. So this isn't a new issue per se, it's just getting new attention. I think it's an amazing challenge as a writer to write about someone who is outwardly really different than you. And I think it can be really enriching. So no one, really that I read in the course of this was, this whole journey of reading about sensitivity readers and these various literary scandals were saying that no writer should write outside of their own lived experience. Like, of course that's not true. But just, that it's a bigger challenge. So approach it that way, and I think you will do great. Okay, guys, well, I hope this series has been helpful to you in understanding some of these issues. As always, if you want to do a deeper dive, I write blog posts to go along with these videos every week where I link to all the things I talk about and just go into a little bit more depth. So check that out if you want. And if you find these videos helpful, please share them. That is helpful to me, and I will see you next time.